You are standing across the cage from a man you have trained your entire life to beat. You have the reach. You have the power. Your coaches have watched every one of his fights, broken down every habit, mapped every weakness on a whiteboard in a gym on the other side of the world. The bell rings, and within seconds he is on you. Not swinging, not even trying to hurt you yet, just walking through your punches like they are weather. He gets one hand on your hip, then the other, and then you are on the ground, and you already know, somewhere underneath the adrenaline, that you are not getting back up until this is over. A fluke, a lucky matchup, one really good guy who happened to come from a strange little corner of the map. That is the story most fans tell themselves the first time they see it happen. Here is what is actually true. It is not one guy. It is a region smaller than a mid-sized American city that has, in the space of about 2 decades, produced an undefeated UFC champion, the man who succeeded him and beat him at his own game, a 2-time Olympic wrestling champion nicknamed the Russian Tank, and a list of world and Olympic medalists so long that international federations have simply run out of ways to describe it as a coincidence. Dagestan, a republic tucked into Russia's North Caucasus Mountains, has a population of roughly 3 million people. That is smaller than the city of Los Angeles. And yet it has become, by almost any measure you choose, wrestling's most disproportionately dominant piece of ground on the entire planet. So the real question was never, why is this one fighter so good? The real question is this: what is happening in that region, across generations, that keeps producing people who are almost impossible to beat on the ground? And what does the answer say about everyone else who is losing to them? Let's get into it. Start with the part that sounds like an exaggeration but is not. In the mountain villages of the North Caucasus, wrestling was never a sport you opted into the way a kid in another country might sign up for youth soccer. For generations, young men from neighboring Alls, the small mountain villages scattered across Dagestan's ridgelines, would wrestle each other in informal matches that had nothing to do with medals or federations. It was how you settled disputes between villages without settling them with knives. It was how you proved, to yourself and to everyone watching, that you could be trusted to protect your family if the moment ever called for it. This was not a metaphor about toughness. This was literal, practical, socially load-bearing behavior, baked into the culture long before anyone in the region had ever heard of the Olympics, let alone the UFC. And the region gave that culture a reason to stay sharp. For decades in the 19th century, the peoples of the North Caucasus fought one of the longest and most stubborn resistance wars against an empire that the world had ever seen. Beginning in the early 1800s and stretching for nearly 50 years, highland communities across Dagestan and Chechnya resisted the expanding Russian Empire, absorbing repeated invasions from a force that vastly outnumbered them in men, artillery, and supply lines. Under the leadership of Imam Shamil, who united dozens of villages speaking dozens of different languages under a single banner of resistance, the mountain fighters held off Imperial Russia for roughly 25 years before he was finally captured in 1859. 25 years, against an empire that, at the same time, was fighting wars against the Ottomans and the Persians, and still finding the resources to keep pushing into the Caucasus. You do not produce that kind of resistance by accident. You produce it because fighting skill, physical toughness, and an absolute refusal to be the first man to quit had already become part of how families raise their sons, generation after generation, long before anyone was thinking about medals. Fast forward through the Soviet period, and something else gets layered onto that foundation. In the 1920s, the Soviet Red Army needed a hand-to-hand combat system that could take the best techniques from the many different wrestling traditions scattered across its vast territory and blend them into something standardized and brutally effective. The result was Sambo, a hybrid grappling art combining judo, traditional folk wrestling styles from across the Soviet Union, and practical striking defense. It was designed by soldiers, for soldiers, with the explicit goal of being usable in a real fight rather than just a competition mat. Dagestan, already saturated with wrestling culture, absorbed Sambo almost immediately and became one of its strongholds. By the time the Soviet Union began sending athletes to international wrestling competitions in the mid-20th century, Dagestani wrestlers were already producing champions. Ali Aliyev became the first wrestler from the Republic to win a world title, claiming the first of his 5 world championships in 1959. the same year, coincidentally, that Imam Shamil's resistance had finally ended exactly a century earlier. There is now an annual international wrestling tournament, held in Aliev's name, and it has become one of the sport's most prestigious events. A proving ground where the next generation of Dagestani wrestlers first announces itself to the world. So by the time mixed martial arts arrived as a global sport in the 1990s and 2000s, Dagestan was not starting from zero. It was starting from roughly a century of state-sponsored wrestling infrastructure, layered on top of centuries of village-level wrestling culture, layered on top of century of successfully resisting a vastly larger military power through sheer stubbornness and technical skill. There are three separate reasons packed into this story, and we have only really covered the first one. The second reason is about what happens to a kid who grows up in this environment before he ever steps into a gym. And the third reason, the one almost nobody outside the region actually understands, is going to change the way you watch every fight this style wins from here on. Let's get into the names, because the numbers involved are staggering. Khabib Nurmagomedov retired from the UFC in 2020 with a professional record of 29 wins and 0 losses. He was never knocked down in his entire career. He was never seriously cut. He held the UFC lightweight title for 2.5 years, the longest reign in the division's history, and defended it 3 times, finishing every single one of those defenses by submission. In one especially absurd performance early in his career, he landed 21 takedowns in a single fight, a UFC record that still stands. His striking, his cardio, his ability to walk through punches without flinching, all of it existed to serve one purpose: get you to the ground, and once he was there, you were not getting back up. He fought under a 2-time World Sambo Championship background and a lifetime of freestyle wrestling, and by the time he arrived in the UFC, he had already logged, by some estimates, hundreds of competitive bouts before most Western fighters had finished high school. His successor, Islam Makhachev, trained alongside him for years under the same coach, Khabib's own father, Abdulrashid Nurmagomedov, a legendary trainer who built much of the region's modern fight infrastructure before his death. Makhachev took the lightweight throne after Khabib retired and has defended it by doing almost exactly what his training partner did, walking opponents into the fence, chaining takedown attempt into takedown attempt until one finally lands, and grinding out rounds that other fighters simply cannot escape. And this is not confined to one gym or one family lineage. On the pure wrestling side, away from cages and cameras entirely, the numbers are arguably even more absurd. Buvaisar Saitiev, born in the Dagestani city of Caucasus to a Chechen family, won 3 Olympic gold medals across 3 different Olympic Games and 6 World Championships, finishing his career with 9 total world-level titles, a total surpassed by only one wrestler in the sport's entire history. Judges and rival coaches did not just call him great. They called him the most technically perfect freestyle wrestler anyone had ever watched compete. Abdulrashid Sadulaev, born in the small Dagestani village of Tsurib, picked up the torch behind him, becoming a 2-time Olympic champion and 6-time world champion, earning the nickname the Russian Tank for a fighting style that simply does not slow down for the length of an entire match. Here is the part that should stop you for a second. These are not isolated prodigies who happen to be born in the same general area, the way you might get one incredible athlete out of a small town anywhere in the world. This is generation after generation, discipline after discipline, wrestling and Sambo, and now mixed martial arts, all coming out of a republic with a population smaller than a single American city. That is not luck. That is a system. And to understand how the system actually works, day to day, on the ground, you need to see what a training camp there actually looks like, because it is not what most Western fans picture at all. Here is the part that nobody outside the region expects, and it is not what you think it is. Most people assume the secret is physical, altitude training in the mountains, some brutal supplement of hill sprints and stone lifting that builds a kind of durability Western gyms simply cannot replicate. And it is true that many Dagestani fighters do train in high-altitude conditions, and it is true that traditional strength exercises, like lifting heavy stones the way villagers have for generations, still show up in modern training camps. But that is not actually the twist. Plenty of athletes around the world train at altitude. Plenty of athletes lift heavy things. That alone does not explain why a region with 3 million people keeps outperforming countries with 50 or 100 times that population. The real twist is about repetition, and specifically about how early it starts and how much of it there is. Coaches who work with young fighters arriving from Dagestan into major American gyms have described athletes showing up with 200 or more competitive fights already on their record before they ever set foot in the UFC, fights that began as early as 6 years old. Think about what that actually means. A fighter from almost anywhere else in the world might have 10 or 20 amateur fights before turning professional. A wrestler from Dagestan might have wrestled more competitive matches by age 18 than most professional fighters have in their entire careers. It is not that the training is more intense in any single session. It is that the sheer volume of live, competitive repetition, starting from early childhood and never really stopping, produces a kind of instinctive, second-nature grappling ability that cannot be replicated by starting later, no matter how talented or how hardworking the athlete is. By the time these fighters reach the world stage, they are not thinking through their takedowns. They are not calculating angles in real time, the way a fighter who started at 19 might still be doing. The technique has been drilled so many thousands of times, against so many different bodies, in so many different situations, that it has become closer to reflex than to skill. During the Soviet decades, this culture nearly went dormant in some places. Central planning did not always prioritize small mountain republics, and for a stretch of years, many villages had no dedicated gyms at all, no mats, no formal coaching infrastructure, just the informal, ground-level wrestling tradition that had never really disappeared. What eventually revived and then supercharged the whole system was the arrival of dedicated Sambo and wrestling clubs in cities like Makhachev and Caucasus in the latter half of the 20th century, staffed by coaches who had themselves come up through that same village tradition and understood exactly what raw material they were working with. Once those clubs existed, the pipeline effectively completed itself. A boy could walk in the door already possessing instincts his counterparts elsewhere would spend years trying to build from scratch, and a trained coach could then spend that boy's entire childhood refining instinct into technique, technique into reflex, without ever having to first convince him that fighting mattered. There is a second layer to the twist, and it has to do with why so many of these athletes push through injuries that would sideline fighters anywhere else. Coaches who have worked closely with Dagestani fighters have described athletes willing to compete with dislocated shoulders, fractured hands, and injuries that would normally trigger an immediate withdrawal, because for many of them, fighting is not simply a career choice among several options. It is described by people who have trained alongside them as something closer to the only real option available, a route out of genuine economic hardship in a region that historically saw very little of the industrial investment that flowed into other parts of the old Soviet Union. Add to that a cultural emphasis on discipline tied closely to religious practice, with many fighters describing a lifestyle built around training rather than nightlife. And you get athletes who are not just technically excellent. You get athletes who treat every single fight as an event they simply cannot afford to lose, in a way that is very difficult to fully replicate if you grew up with a genuine financial safety net underneath you. And there is one more piece, maybe the most important one, that almost never makes it into the highlight reels. It is the community itself. Fighters from the region consistently describe an almost unbelievable level of mutual support, training together, sharing coaching insight freely with rivals from their own home villages, treating another fighter's win as a win for the whole region rather than a threat to their own status. In a sport built around ruthless individual competition, that kind of collective loyalty is strange enough to be its own advantage. Young fighters are not just training against each other. They are training with an entire ecosystem of former champions who have every incentive to make sure the next generation is even better than they were, because the honor belongs to everyone who came from the same mountains. There is a technical detail buried inside all of this that most casual fans never notice, but that every coach who has tried and failed to prepare a fighter to face this style will tell you about immediately. It is called chain wrestling, and it is less a single technique than an entire philosophy of how a takedown should work. A wrestler trained in most systems around the world learns a takedown as a discrete move. Shoot for the legs, land it or do not, reset, try again. A fighter raised in the Dagestani system is taught something closer to the opposite. The first attempt is rarely meant to actually succeed. It is meant to create a reaction, a flinch, a shift in weight, a moment where the opponent's balance moves half an inch in a predictable direction. The instant that happens, the attack changes, sliding from a double leg into a single leg, or from a single leg into a body lock against the fence, without ever stopping to reset. Watching it in slow motion, commentators often describe it as watching a single unbroken sentence rather than a series of separate words. For an opponent, defending one takedown attempt from this style does not mean the danger has passed. It means the next attempt, slightly different, is already arriving before the first one has even finished failing. And this style has not stayed confined to Dagestan alone. Neighboring Chechnya, sharing much of the same historical resistance against Imperial Russia, and much of the same wrestling and Sambo infrastructure built during the Soviet period, has begun producing its own wave of fighters carrying an almost identical approach into international competition, including a new generation making waves in the UFC's middleweight and welterweight divisions. The style is regional in the fullest sense, not tied to one bloodline or one gym, but to an entire cultural corridor running through the North Caucasus Mountains, where the same historical pressures produced remarkably similar responses in village after village, valley after valley. Put all three of those pieces together. Decades of raw competitive volume starting in early childhood, a cultural and economic backdrop that turns every fight into something closer to necessity than sport, and a communal training structure that multiplies individual talent instead of hoarding it. None of those three things, on their own, would be enough to explain what has happened. Together, they built something that looks, from the outside, almost unfair. Which brings us to the only honest question left. Why does almost nowhere else in the world do this? Because here is the uncomfortable mirror this whole story is pointing at. In most of the developed world, we have built systems that are, in a very real sense, the opposite of everything described above. We specialize children late instead of early, worried about burnout and overtraining, and there is genuine wisdom in some of that caution. We treat sport as one option among many, rather than a singular, all-consuming path, which is, in most respects, a healthier way to raise a human being. We build safety nets, social and financial, that reduce the desperate edge that turns a hobby into a necessity. Almost none of that is wrong. Most of it reflects real progress, real care for the well-being of young people who deserve more than a childhood spent purely in pursuit of a medal. But it does mean that when a fighter with genuine, once-in-a-generation talent from a wealthy, comfortable country steps into the cage against a fighter who started wrestling before he could read, who has logged more live rounds by his teenage years than most professionals ever will, and who is fighting with the weight of an entire mountain region's pride and survival behind him, the fight was never really happening on equal footing to begin with. The skill gap is not a mystery. It is the visible, physical result of two completely different answers to the same question. How much are you willing to sacrifice, and how early are you willing to start? There is something almost humbling in that. It is easy to watch a fighter get taken down 21 times in a single bout and think you are watching a freak of nature, a 1 in a billion genetic outlier who simply cannot be replicated. But that framing, weirdly, is the more comfortable story. It lets everyone else off the hook. The truth is less comfortable and more interesting. What you are actually watching, more often than not, is the accumulated weight of an entire regional culture, stretching back through Soviet-era Sambo academies, through Imperial-era resistance wars fought in the same mountains, through village disputes settled on wrestling mats instead of with weapons, distilled down into a single person standing in a cage under bright lights. So the next time you watch a fighter from that part of the world walk through strikes that would stop most opponents cold, and calmly, patiently, methodically drag another human being to the canvas and keep him there until the final horn, remember what you are actually seeing. It is not one man's talent. It is a mountain range's worth of history, distilled into a single pair of hands. And somewhere in that thought is a quieter, more personal question worth sitting with. Not how did they get so good, but what would any of us be capable of if the place we came from had spent generations refusing to let us quit?